I am Victoria Hayes, 36 years old, and I will never forget the moment my sister ripped my wig off in front of 200 wedding guests. The sound of their laughter, the sight of my daughter Sophie crying into my arms, it burned into me like fire. For a heartbeat, I wanted to run, but then the groom walked back in with clippers buzzing in his hand, and what he did next silenced the entire room. The evening air in Denver was heavy with July heat, as I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the ivory wedding invitation. The silver embossing caught the light twisting into vines that framed my sister Lydia's name. Estes Park Resort Mountain Views formal attire. It looked more like an advertisement for perfection than an invitation to a family event. My daughter Sophie sat across from me with her crayons spread in a rainbow humming, as if the world outside our little townhouse could not touch her. She was 11, old enough to notice the tension in my shoulders, but young enough to still trust my lies when I told her everything was fine. The envelope in my hand might as well have been a verdict. Lydia was 33 now, the golden child, the one our parents had bragged about since the day she learned to tie her shoes. I was 36, the older daughter who had carried responsibility like a backpack made of stone. I remembered one summer afternoon years ago when my father Charles clinked his glass at a family reunion. He wrapped his arm around Lydia and boomed to a crowd of cousins that she was the pride of our family. I had been 16 balancing a plate of potato salad and forced my lips into a smile so hard it made my jaw ache. I never forgot how it felt to disappear in a room full of people. Now that memory pressed against me as I thought about tomorrow. Sophie glanced up, her brown eyes steady, and asked if I was nervous about the wedding. I smoothed her hair and told her no, that it would be fine, that families had awkward moments, but we would get through them together. She nodded as if she believed me and leaned against my shoulder. Her trust was the reason I could not stay home. She had to see me walk into that resort with my head high, even if every part of me wanted to run. I had worked for years at a marketing firm in downtown Denver, careful with every paycheck. Little by little, I built Sophie's college fund until it reached $20,000. It was the one thing I was proud of, proof that my sacrifices meant something. My mother, Margaret, never missed a chance to call me selfish for protecting that money instead of helping Lydia pay for dresses or parties. I learned to smile and say nothing, but their words still found a way to sting. They never understood that my daughter's future mattered more to me than their approval. After Sophie went upstairs, I stood in the doorway of her room, watching her drift to sleep under the glow of her lamp. Her hand clutched the blanket, her breathing even and soft. I whispered promises I had never dared to speak aloud, that she would never doubt her worth in my eyes, that she would never feel like the forgotten child. Tomorrow, no matter what, I would hold my head up for her. That vow was the only armor I had. I returned to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, trying to quiet the storm in my chest. The invitation still lay on the counter, its perfect script spelling out the day I dreaded. I pushed it into the drawer and closed it with more force than necessary. The house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. I turned off the light and started toward the stairs when my phone buzzed. The screen lit with a new message from Lydia. The words were sharp and cold, telling me exactly where I would be seated and reminding me not to make the day about myself. I stood frozen in the dark kitchen, the glow of the phone burning into my palm, and I knew this wedding would be nothing like the peaceful family celebration Sophie imagined. The restaurant smelled of butter and roasted garlic, the kind of scent that clung to your clothes long after you left. I sat at the end of a polished oak table set for 10. Sophie beside me with her hands folded in her lap. Lydia arrived last, sweeping into the room in a red silk dress that caught every flicker of light. The hostess pulled out a chair for her near the center, directly across from our parents. She sat down with the confidence of someone who already knew the room belonged to her. Dinner began with small talk about the drive up from Denver and the weather forecast for tomorrow's ceremony. I tried to keep my voice calm as I asked Sophie if she wanted more bread, but Lydia's words cut through the chatter. She leaned back, her glass of wine in hand, and announced that where everyone sat at the wedding would show their true place in the family. Her eyes found mine, and the corners of her mouth twitched in satisfaction. My parents. Charles and Margaret chuckled like it was a clever joke. No one else at the table seemed surprised. Patrick sat 2 seats down, rolling the stem of his glass between his fingers. He was 39 now, grayer at the temples, and still avoiding conflict the way he always had. He gave me a quick look, then dropped his eyes back to his plate. Sophie squeezed my hand under the table. She might not have understood every word, but she felt the tension settling like smoke. I tried to keep my breathing even to focus on the salad in front of me. When I finally opened my mouth to speak, Lydia's voice snapped sharper, her smile fading into something cruel. She said the family house would belong to her one day, that I should not waste energy hoping otherwise. My fork slipped against the plate, the sound louder than it should have been. My mother nodded gently, as if Lydia had said something reasonable. My father cleared his throat but did not contradict her. No one defended me, not even Patrick. The silence pressed down harder than any insult. Sophie's small fingers dug tighter into my hand. I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat and said nothing. To argue would have given them exactly what they wanted. Another reason to call me dramatic. Another story to retell about how I ruined a family dinner. But inside, the fire burned hotter, climbing into my chest, until I felt it behind my eyes. The entrees arrived, plates of steak and roasted vegetables, but the taste turned to ash in my mouth. Lydia laughed brightly at something one of her bridesmaids whispered, then raised her glass. She called for a toast, her voice clear and commanding, and told the table that tomorrow would finally be the day she received the recognition she deserved. Everyone lifted their glasses, even my parents, and laughter rippled around me. I could not move. My glass stayed on the table untouched, as I stared at the condensation sliding down its side. Sophie glanced up, confusion shadowing her young face, and I managed a small smile only for her. The clinking of glasses rang in my ears long after the toast ended. I chewed another bite I could not taste and pretended to listen as conversations bloomed again, but my mind was already racing ahead. The house, the inheritance, the wedding, all of it layered into something heavier than I had prepared for. My parents' silence felt like betrayal as sharp as Lydia's words. I had promised myself not to run, but I could already see how tomorrow would test that vow. When the check arrived, Lydia insisted she would cover nothing since she had a wedding to pay for. My parents nodded as if that was obvious, and Patrick reached for his wallet before I caught his eye and shook my head. I signed the slip myself, slid the receipt back to the waiter, and felt Lydia's stare like a knife against my skin. On the drive home, Sophie leaned her head against the window, whispering that she did not like how Aunt Lydia spoke to me. I told her not to worry, but my hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. The mountain shadows swallowed the road ahead, and in the pit of my stomach, I knew this dinner had only been the opening move. The real battle would unfold when we stepped into that resort the next day. The morning sun reflected off the mountains as Sophie and I pulled into the parking lot of the Estes Park Resort. Cars lined the road, guests spilling out in tailored suits and dresses that shimmered in the light. Sophie clutched my hand, her new dress, pale blue and simple, nothing like the gowns gliding past us. I had chosen a modest navy skirt and blouse, clean and pressed, but already I felt the heat of judgmental eyes. The chatter of guests drifted around us, filled with excitement about Lydia's wedding, every voice carrying the same admiration for the bride who was about to take center stage. Inside the lobby smelled of lilies and polished wood. A signboard directed guests to the reception hall, and when I reached the check-in desk, I gave my name. The young woman scanning the list frowned, flipped a page, then finally pointed us toward a side door. I thanked her, though my stomach turned. As we walked through, my suspicion became real. Our table was tucked near the swinging doors that led to the service hallway. The tablecloth had a wrinkle running down the middle, the silverware not polished like the others. Sophie looked up at me confused. I forced a smile and told her it was fine, but my face burned. From where we sat, I could see the grand ballroom stretched in front of us. Chandeliers hung low, their crystals scattering light across tables arranged in elegant circles. Names printed on thick white cards marked each place. I searched quickly for mine among the main seating, but found nothing. It was clear. I was not part of the picture Lydia wanted her guests to see. Whispered voices trickled from nearby tables. Someone leaned over to ask who we were. Another laughed and muttered that it was the sister. My throat tightened. I held Sophie's hand beneath the table, squeezing it like an anchor. As servers began pouring champagne, I felt a tap on my shoulder. Maddie, a colleague from my office, leaned down. Her hair was pulled back into a neat bun. Her dress understated but elegant. She whispered that she had not expected to see me placed all the way back here. Before I could answer, she warned me in a hushed tone that at work a single careless video could ruin reputations in hours. She told me to be cautious that people recorded everything at events like this. I nodded stiffly, grateful for her honesty. Though her words only deepened my unease, she squeezed my shoulder, then slipped back to her own table near the front, where her laughter joined a circle of other guests. The music shifted as the bridal party prepared to enter. Sophie's eyes widened as the room hushed all attention, turning toward the double doors. When they opened, Lydia appeared draped in a gown that sparkled like ice, her smile radiant. The guests erupted in applause. She walked gracefully, her arm linked with our father, who looked proud, his chest puffed, as if he had achieved something himself. I sat frozen, my nails pressing into my palms, trying not to let Sophie see the tremor in my hands. Then, Lydia's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on me. Her smile changed just for a second into something sharper, a glint of triumph in her eyes. It was not the smile of a bride lost in happiness. It was a victory grin directed only at me. The applause grew echoing off the ballroom walls, but I heard none of it. My heart pounded louder than the music, louder than the cheers. Sophie shifted uncomfortably in her seat and whispered that she wanted to go home. I bent toward her and whispered back that we could not yet. My daughter's worried face twisted the knife deeper. I had dragged her into this theater, and now she was trapped with me in the shadows, while the rest of the family basked in the glow. The ceremony began, the officiant's words floating over the room. My mind drifted, each phrase sliding past as I struggled to steady my breathing. Across the aisle, I saw Rachel Carter, the groom's mother, standing with a presence that demanded attention. I recognized her from news stories, a respected judge with a reputation for her uncompromising fairness. She watched the proceedings with cool eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I felt seen, as if someone else in the room understood the cruelty behind the staging. The vows were about to begin, and the guests leaned in hungry for the spectacle. I adjusted Sophie's chair and forced a steady smile, but my chest ached with the certainty that this was only the beginning. Lydia had claimed her stage, and soon she would make her next move. The clinking of forks and low hum of conversation filled the ballroom once the ceremony ended and the reception began. Plates of steak and salmon were being served, glasses of champagne refilled, and laughter rose above the music as guests settled into their seats. I kept my eyes on Sophie, cutting her chicken into small pieces and pretending not to notice the way heads turned in our direction now and then. The weight of being placed in the corner pressed harder with every glance. Across the room, Lydia shined in her gown, surrounded by bridesmaids and guests who seemed to orbit her like she was the center of the universe. She waved to someone near the band, then whispered something to the woman beside her. When she looked back toward me, her expression shifted. That familiar smirk crawled across her lips, the one that said she had already decided her next move. I gripped my napkin tighter in my lap, a silent prayer that she would stay in her seat. She did not. The music softened as Lydia rose. The room seemed to notice, eyes following her as she stepped away from the head table. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step deliberate. I felt Sophie shrink closer to me, her small hand searching for mine. Lydia's voice rang sweet and sharp when she reached my table, pitched so the nearest guests could hear. She said everyone was curious to see my real hair. My heart thudded, and before I could react, she reached out, fingers hooking against the edge of my wig. She yanked hard. The world blurred. Cold air touched my scalp as the wig came away. Gasps rippled through the tables, followed by laughter that stung sharper than any slap. Phones were raised, screens glowing as guests recorded what had just happened. A voice somewhere whispered that it was pitiful. The humiliation washed over me in waves, leaving me frozen in my chair. Sophie's cry cut through the noise, her arms wrapping around me as if she could shield me. My daughter buried her face against my side, sobbing that she wanted to go home. Margaret's voice drifted from the main table, feigning concern, while dismissing it all as a playful joke between sisters. Her words only made the laughter spread wider, guests shaking their heads like it was all harmless fun. My throat closed. Blood pounded in my ears. I could feel every stare, every cruel grin, every phone capturing an image I could never take back. Heat surged up my neck, my vision prickling at the edges. I wanted to disappear, to melt into the wall and never be seen again. My fingers trembled as I pulled Sophie close and rose from the table. The chairs scraped loudly as I pushed them back, the noise barely cutting through the roar of laughter. I did not look at Lydia, but I felt her triumph burning into my back, as clearly as if she had shouted it. She stood with her shoulders square, wig in her hand, like a trophy. I held Sophie tight, her tears dampening my blouse, and moved quickly toward the exit. The room seemed endless, every step a battle against eyes that judged and mocked. My legs shook, but I forced them forward, determined not to collapse before I reached the doors. The music swelled again, trying to drown the chaos, but all I heard was the sound of Sophie's crying and the rush of my own blood. When we finally pushed through into the hallway, the door closing behind us, the noise dulled into a muffled roar. I leaned against the wall chest, heaving Sophie clinging to me. For a moment, I could not breathe. The humiliation sat like fire in my lungs, but beneath it, something else flickered, something darker and stronger. I knew the night was far from over. Lydia had played her hand, and now the entire room was watching to see what I would do next. The hallway outside the ballroom was colder than I expected, the air conditioning blasting against my damp skin. I leaned against the wall, my knees weak. Sophie pressed into me with her arms tight around my waist. Her sobs had softened into hiccups, but each sound still cut me in half. My phone buzzed in my purse, a vibration sharp against my ribs. I fumbled it out and saw Maddie's name. Her voice was urgent, too fast. She said the video of Lydia pulling off my wig was already in the office group chat, passed around like it was some kind of party trick. She warned me that once it left that circle, it would spread, that reputations at work were fragile, and people loved a scandal more than the truth. I froze the phone slick in my hand. My job was the one place I had carved a space where effort mattered, and now even that could be poisoned by Lydia's cruelty. Before I could answer, a firm voice called my name. I turned and saw Daniel Brooks walking down the hall. He had been a friend years ago now, a lawyer I trusted, and he had seen enough to understand. His jaw was tight as he told me that what Lydia did was assault, plain and simple. He said if I wanted, I could call the police right now, file a report, and no one could dismiss it as a joke. His words steadied me for a moment, gave shape to the storm inside me. Then my father appeared, his steps heavy, his expression thunderous. Charles looked at Daniel with disdain and told him this was a family matter, not something to drag into court. He turned on me, his voice low but sharp, telling me not to make it bigger than it already was. If I went further, he said I would only humiliate us all, and Lydia's wedding would be remembered for chaos instead of joy. His disappointment struck harder than the laughter had. He had chosen his side long ago, but hearing it so plainly still felt like a blade. Sophie tugged at my hand, her small voice trembling as she begged me to take her home. Her wide eyes searched mine, desperate for safety. Every muscle in me screamed to leave, to gather my child, and run to hide until the storm passed. My chest heaved with the weight of it. I closed my eyes and almost gave in. But then I looked at her, her fingers clutching mine, her face streaked with tears. If I walked away now, she would learn that silence was the answer to cruelty, that humiliation was something we had to swallow. I could not teach her that. My shame shifted into something heavier, hotter. I stood taller, wiping her cheeks with my thumb, whispering that she was safe. Daniel watched me, nodding once, as if he understood the choice hardening inside me. My father shook his head, muttering that I was reckless, but I barely heard him. The sound of the music and laughter seeping from the ballroom walls reminded me that the people inside were waiting to see if I would disappear or fight. I pulled Sophie against me, straightened my shoulders, and took a long breath that burned all the way down. My legs steadied beneath me, and the tremor in my hands slowed. I knew the next step would draw every eye, but the decision was made. I pushed the door back open, the noise of the reception rushing toward me, and stepped forward with my daughter beside me, ready to face the fire again. The music hit me first, a brassy swell from the band that tried to mask the restless chatter. Sophie held my hand tightly as we stepped back into the ballroom. Heads turned, phones still raised, conversations pausing mid-sentence. I felt the heat of their stares burn across my skin, but I lifted my chin and kept walking toward our table. Lydia sat at the head table, her wig trophy nowhere in sight, her expression smug, as if she had already won. The laughter had dulled into uneasy whispers when the side doors near the groom's quarters opened. Ethan appeared, his tux jacket unbuttoned, his face pale, but steady. In his right hand gleamed an electric clipper cord, dangling, still humming faintly from being tested. The room quieted in an instant, as if someone had pulled the air from the space. The servers froze mid-step, and even the band faltered, one violin squeaking before falling silent. Ethan walked straight to the center of the room and stopped. He looked at me first, his eyes soft with something close to apology, then turned toward Lydia. His voice carried without a microphone sharp enough to slice through the silence. He said that if the family thought a woman's worth could be measured by her hair, then he wanted no part of that illusion. His words struck like a bell, and before anyone could process them, he flicked the switch. The buzz filled the hall, loud and relentless. He pressed the clipper to his temple and drove it back across his scalp. Tufts of dark hair fell onto his shoulders and scattered on the polished floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by stunned silence. No one laughed this time. I felt Sophie clutch my arm, whispering his name in disbelief. Lydia jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly, and hurried toward him, pleading with him to stop. Her voice cracked high and panicked, but Ethan did not flinch. He shaved line after line until the crown of his head gleamed under the chandeliers. The air in the room shifted. A bridesmaid covered her mouth, tears slipping down her cheeks. An older guest shook his head, muttering that he had never seen anything like it. Phones still filmed, but the tone of the room had changed. What had been cruel entertainment only minutes earlier had turned into something else entirely, something raw and uncomfortable. Lydia reached for the clippers, but Ethan pulled back and stared at her. His voice dropped lower, but everyone heard it. He told her that humiliating someone was not love, not family, not the kind of life he wanted to build. He said it with finality, laying each word on the room like a weight no one could lift. Lydia's hand fell to her side. She looked around as if searching for support, but none came. Even Margaret and Charles avoided her eyes, their faces stiff with shame. When Ethan finished, he shut off the clippers and set them down on the head table with a deliberate clatter. The buzzing stopped, and the silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. He stood there, hair scattered around his shoes, his jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling. For a long moment no one spoke. No one moved. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from humiliation this time, but from the shock of someone finally cutting through the cruelty. Sophie pressed her face against my side, whispering that he was brave. My heart ached with gratitude and fear all at once. I knew nothing about what this meant for his marriage, for the family ties unraveling in front of us, but I knew the ground had shifted. The band did not start again. Guests whispered behind their hands, some wiping their eyes, others frozen in disbelief. Lydia stood at the edge of the room, her perfect gown shimmering under the lights, but for the first time she looked small. The silence held, waiting for the next blow to fall, and I realized the night was far from over. A sharp voice cut through the silence, firm and commanding. Rachel Carter stepped away from her table, her heels striking the floor like a gavel. She moved to the center of the room, her presence so steady that every whisper died. She announced that in this country, ripping someone's hairpiece off in public was not a joke. It could be classified as assault, and the victim had every right to file a police report. The words landed with the force of law, and the ballroom froze. Forks stilled midair, phones lowered, even the band held their breath. Lydia's cheeks flushed crimson. She sputtered that it had only been playful, nothing serious, and tried to laugh it off. Her voice wavered when no one joined in. Rachel's eyes narrowed, her silence more punishing than her words. Lydia's composure cracked, and then almost in panic she blurted that she only wanted me gone, that even the family house should have been hers. The gasp from the guests spread like a wave. Heads turned, eyes widened, and I watched years of carefully polished image shatter in seconds. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes darting anywhere but at me. My father shifted in his chair, his face hard, but unsure the authority he once carried, evaporating under the scrutiny of the crowd. Lydia's words echoed ugly and desperate, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. I felt Sophie squeeze my arm, her small body trembling, but I held steady. For the first time, I was not the one exposed. The room's attention turned away from me and squarely onto Lydia. She had drawn her own noose, and everyone saw it tighten. Patrick rose slowly from his chair. His movements drew attention because he had been silent all evening, the brother who never chose sides. He straightened his tie, his voice low but clear as he told Lydia she had gone too far. He said it with a weight that came from years of watching quietly, years of swallowing the same favoritism I had endured. He did not look at me, but for once he did not look away either. Murmurs broke out louder now, harsher. Guests shook their heads, some whispering about cruelty, others about entitlement. A bridesmaid slipped her phone back into her purse, her face pale with shame for being complicit. One of the groom's uncles muttered that if this was the bride's true nature, the marriage was doomed before it began. Lydia spun in place, searching for allies, but found none. Even Ethan, hair freshly shorn and jaw tight, would not meet her eyes. I watched my parents crumble in their seats, their silence damning. The foundation of favoritism they had built for Lydia had cracked under the weight of her own words. For once they had no excuse to shield her, no laughter to smooth over her cruelty. Their daughter had exposed herself, and nothing could be undone. Rachel cleared her throat, commanding silence once more. She reminded the room that dignity mattered, that the law protected those humiliated as I had been. Her tone was not only a warning to Lydia, but a reassurance to me. I had not imagined the cruelty, and I did not have to carry it alone. The ballroom was no longer a celebration. It had turned into a trial, and Lydia stood accused before everyone she had hoped to impress. My hands trembled slightly, but not from fear. For the first time in years, I felt the scale tilt, not because I had forced it, but because truth had finally spoken for itself. I glanced down at Sophie, who wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She looked at me differently, with something like pride. I brushed her hair back gently, my chest tight, knowing the storm was not finished yet. The vows had been said, but the marriage itself now hung in the balance, and Ethan had yet to deliver his verdict. Ethan stepped forward, his freshly shaven head gleaming under the lights, and the chatter in the ballroom went still. His voice was steady, but carried the exhaustion of a man pushed too far. He said that marriage could not be built on cruelty, that if Lydia wanted to be his wife, she would have to change from the root, or there would be nothing left between them. The words rang out like a sentence, and the silence afterward was crushing. Lydia's painted smile faltered, her hands twisting in front of her as she tried to laugh it away, but the damage was done. The guests began to move not toward her, but toward me. A woman I barely knew touched my arm and whispered that she was sorry for laughing. An older man shook his head and told me I had handled myself with dignity. One by one, people came to me, not her, their apologies spilling like an unexpected tide. Sophie pressed close to me, her face still blotchy from crying, but her chin lifted higher as each apology came. For the first time, she saw me not as the butt of their jokes, but as someone others were finally respecting. My phone buzzed in my purse, and I pulled it out to see a message from Maddie. She wrote that the clip was spreading beyond our office now, but the comments were not mocking me. People were calling me brave, calling out Lydia's cruelty, saying the groom's stand had turned the night upside down. Maddie told me not to be afraid that the tide of public opinion was on my side. I exhaled slowly, the knot in my stomach loosening just a little. Daniel Brooks approached, then his presence calm in the chaos. He told me plainly that if I wanted to press charges, I had a case. Assault did not vanish because it happened at a wedding. He said he would support me whatever I decided. I nodded, though the thought of another fight exhausted me. Still, the offer meant more than I could put into words. Across the room, Lydia clung to my parents, her face pale and her eyes wild. Margaret whispered in her ear. Charles tried to straighten his tie as if dignity could be forced back into place, but they looked smaller than I had ever seen them. Their power, their favoritism had cracked open in front of everyone, and nothing they said could fix it. Patrick stood off to the side, his gaze steady on me. Not Lydia. It was the first time in my life I felt like he had chosen to see me. The band never resumed. The reception unraveled into scattered conversations, plates left half-eaten guests, excusing themselves early. The fairy tale Lydia wanted had collapsed into whispers and shaken heads. Ethan remained apart from her, speaking quietly with his mother, his jaw clenched. Sophie tugged on my sleeve and asked if we could go home. I told her we would leave soon, but first I wanted her to see something. I bent down and looked her in the eyes, telling her that what happened tonight was cruel and wrong, but that standing tall mattered more than hiding. She nodded, her lips trembling, and hugged me so tightly I could hardly breathe. In that moment, the humiliation I had carried turned into something different. I realized I was no longer the forgotten daughter in the shadows. I was the mother who had shown her child that respect is not given by others, it is claimed by refusing to bow. As we walked out of the ballroom, heads turned, but the stares were not sharp anymore. Some nodded, some even clapped softly, and I held Sophie's hand with a strength I had not felt in years. If you have ever been mocked or dismissed by your own family, you know the sting cuts deeper than any stranger's words. But tonight proved that dignity is not about hair or money or the tables they seat you at. Dignity comes from standing tall when others want to see you broken. Tell me, have you ever faced that moment when you had to decide whether to stay silent or stand your ground? Share your story below, and do not forget to stay with us, because more stories of courage and justice are waiting for you here.